The United States of America was formed out of a blaze of revolution in the 18th century. Within 200 years, the nation reached the height of its power, emerging triumphant and robust, following 2 world wars that devastated many other great nations. However, the history of this region stretches back further and is deeper than most believe. This is the history of the United States of America. Before the formation of the United States, the history of the continent claims diverse and intriguing evolution. The documented voyages and later death of Christopher Columbus paved the way for further Spanish and Portuguese expeditions, which were to reveal the existence of South America. With more accurate data and instruments at their disposal, references by mapmakers stated this was a new world. As stories were told of this new world, many people were intrigued and wanted to see for themselves. Therefore, the United States was to become a nation of immigrants, filled with unwavering optimism and determination to succeed. However, before the settlement by Europeans, and prior to explorers charting the coastlines, the continent was inhabited by various native communities. It is theorized the first people came via Beringia, a land bridge that connected Russia and Alaska during the Ice Age. As the world temperature increased, the glaciers melted, raising the sea levels and thereby closing the land bridge. Over time, these first hunter-gatherers migrated throughout the continent and were the ancestors of all Native Americans. A variety of people, societies, languages and cultures subsequently developed, most of which have been wiped out today. The land, climate and nature were significant influences in the lives and beliefs of those who occupied it. One of the earliest societies was the Mississippi culture, where archaeology has established that they built raised cities and ceremonial burial mounds, with urban settlements sustained by a commendable trading network. In the southwest, the Pueblos were known to have constructed complex multi-story villages built out of stone. To the northeast, 5 and later 6 nations banded together to form the Iroquois Confederacy. They developed a centralized democratic government which comprised of representative chiefs. It is argued that this confederacy was formed shortly before European contact by the peacemaker. However, the actual date is hearsay as no records exist. Perhaps the earliest noteworthy During the 5th century, Europe was enjoying a safe land passage reaching to India and even as far as China. These trade routes along the Silk Road enabled sources of valuable goods such as silks and spices to be traded. With the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, however, the land route to Asia became more difficult. which the colony was known by, produced immense wealth for the Dutch. Other foreign nations began to envy the riches flowing out the Hudson River Valley. The English set up their first colony in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, which became a key exporter of tobacco. With tobacco plantations and colonies expanding, the need for labour became urgent. Indentured servants received paid passage to the Americas, along with food, clothing, and accommodation. Their contract was to work on plantations until their completion of service. With the European arrival, the Iroquois Confederacy became increasingly involved with the fur trade. Dutch tribes to return to their homeland. By the mid-17th century, European ships were sailing to Africa laden with goods, which were to be traded for slaves. These slaves were transported in harsh conditions on crowded ships bound for the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations. This resulted in more productivity for plantation owners. Further trade ships embarked to Europe, where a hungry market awaited highly priced merchandise. By the mid-18th century, France had laid claim to a vast amount of territory, whilst the English territory had evolved into 13 colonies. The English colonies were much smaller in land area compared to New France. However, they had a larger population. In 1754, the French Indian War broke out between Britain and France over disputed lands in the Ohio River Valley. France began the construction of forts in the region. Britain sent troops to stop the construction, and conflict escalated into the 7 Years' War, a colonial war spread over several continents. The conflict and they responded with more regulations and increased army presence. Massachusetts was A year later, they fashioned the Articles of Confederation, which served as its first constitution. Meanwhile, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. France and Spain began to support their efforts by sending supplies and weapons. Washington had moved his army to New York, and as expected, the British arrived with 130 warships and 25,000 troops. The war continued, with victories and defeats for both sides. The American victory at Saratoga would prove to be a turning point for the American Revolution, as it prompted France and later Spain to enter war openly on the side of the Americans. With French assistance, the Continental Army forced with George Washington appointed as the first president in 1789. Having supported the Americans, France amassed substantial debt, which was a major catalyst for the French Revolution. Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821. With a sparsely populated northern territory, the Mexican government welcomed settlers from the United States to further develop the region. Unlike the mainly Catholic Mexican population, many of the new settlers were Protestant, pro-slavery, and patriotic to the United States. It wasn't long before Texas burst into rebellion and won independence from Mexico. Texas tried to join the United States on 2 occasions. However, Texas was rejected because of disagreements regarding the addition of another slave state and the potential of causing conflict with the Mexican government. Change occurred with the election of James K. Polk, who was a stern believer on the idea of manifest destiny. The US annexed Texas in 1845 without the authority from Mexico. Troops were assigned to the border of Mexico and a diplomat was sent to negotiate, but their forces attacked and war broke out. The Mexican-American War saw US victory and resulted in the further expansion of the United States. A border dispute with Britain in the north was also settled, with a 49th parallel forming the border between the US and Canada. With the acquisition of California, the news of gold in the area spread like wildfire. 300,000 people flocked to California from both the United States and overseas. The influx of gold reinvigorated the economy, and the sudden population increase allowed California to grow rapidly to statehood. There were disagreements about whether these newly acquired territories and later states should be free states and other southern states soon encouraging Abraham Lincoln to put forward his Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order that gave freedom to over 3 million slaves in the Confederate States. The Union was unable to defeat General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate forces. General Lee made a push into the north and was met by Union General George Meade at the Battle of Gettysburg. This would be a turning point and the bloodiest battle of the war, lasting 3 days with huge losses on both sides. The Confederate States and their army were weakened. After the loss of Atlanta, it was clear the Confederate States were defeated. On April 9, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant. Lincoln oversaw the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the states, but within days of victory, Lincoln was assassinated while attending a theater in Washington. Interception of a German telegram to Mexico requesting them to invade the US that the United States declared war. The first US infantry troops arrived on the European continent in June 1917. In October, the first American soldiers entered combat. The United States brought freshly trained troops and helped the Allies win victory, but at the cost of over 100,000 soldiers who perished in the fighting. The Wall Street crash and the collapse of the stock market instigated the Great Depression of the 1930s. But within a decade, the US was once again dragged into another world war. support Western Europe economically, spending billions to rebuild and aid the recovery of their allies. Over the next few decades, two military alliances were formed, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Different ideologies of a nation that witnessed the merciless attacks of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. A nation unprepared by a ruthless attack retaliated against a new style of warfare. These attacks not only changed the American nation, they were to change the world. Instead of dividing a nation, the world joined in compassion and cooperation in the fight against a new threat. Today, the United States is a leading world